Says we're picking it up from the incorporation of statehood, California in 1850, New Mexico and Arizona in 1912. I wanted to point to a few of the laws that really began to not only incorporate but displace the Mexicans who had just now become Americans with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And here in California, gold was struck in 1849. You know, we have a football team named after it locally. Some of you might be fans of it. Uh, but this name was created in the NFL again to produce heroes out of those who conquered the territory and who extracted the gold. We know the first person to discover gold was a Mexican national years before, but Mexicans were displaced through force by law. And one of the laws that was enacted upon incorporation of these territories as part of the United States was the foreign miners tax. So the foreign miners tax in 1850 levied a heavy tax on whoever was a foreigner. So meaning the actual natives who were created foreigners by law almost overnight. And this is when we're thinking about our lawmaking processes and how the laws are enacted today. They're presented as being neutral. They are hardly ever. And in this moment, it was a way to remove any non-Anglo, who were the migrants had come in, from extracting and gaining wealth in that moment. This was a key moment where the accumulation of wealth begins to take place. And here you have some of the images of some of the violence enacted by the Anglo migrants over the natives to remove them. And that becomes central as we were discussing on the lynchings of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And another was the Land Grant Act of 1851. So this specified that all land titles held under Spanish or Mexican grants were invalid. Now they had to be verified by U.S. courts. So overnight, the language is removed of Spanish, right? The way the land was cordoned off was now no longer had standing by this new Anglo institution. Now it had to be verified by their means, meaning in English, meaning detailed. And if you have land, it can no longer be defined by the trees or the mountains or the rocks or the rivers. Now you had to have these very clear demarcations of where the land began and where it ended. So overnight, this becomes a mechanism in which this land to be forfeited or given over and not recognized, right? So law's displacement, as we're thinking about this, and here's some of the imagery on the way, some maps to give you an example of how Mexican and these land grants were created or cordoned off. Here, I'm from Los Angeles, as I mentioned. Here is in Palos Verdes down in Southern California. The way it's a very exclusive, very affluent area now. I mean, affluent, not exclusive. But the way that it is constructed and laid out was very different from the way the Anglo courts would need to see it. And in this moment, right, so this is not only a way to be born of conquest, how Lisa Garcia Bedoya gives us many examples of how Mexicans and Mexican Americans enacted forms of resistance. Resistance is part and parcel of that contestation. It was not that Mexicans ceded the land and gave up and said, okay. They launched an offensive in the media, an offensive with armed groups to regain their territory, public assistance amongst themselves, creating mutualistas. But Francisco Ramirez, who in this moment becomes the voice of for that population, but also it chronicles like, wait, become Americanized all over in language, manners, and customs, right? So was he a defender of the population, or was he arguing for assimilation to give up your identity, right? So like it or not, we are under the American flag. Accept your conditions as they are. Let us divest ourselves of all bygone traditions, he says, and become Americanized all over in language, in manners, in customs, and habits. And we know that this did not, even those who attempted to move towards whiteness or U.S. citizenship as it was defined, because one thing when the Mexicans became Americans through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, We know, if we, constitutionally speaking, to be a citizen, you needed to be white. So Mexicans were made legally classified as white in order to make them U.S. citizens. Now, how did that function in law? It was necessary to make them citizens. So being white was a prerequisite to being a U.S. citizen. Thus, the classification of white of Mexicans as white was necessary. But yet, this is where the legal scholar and sociologist, director of the Critical Race Theory Project at UCLA, calls Mexican Americans became an off-white group, right? So this form enacted their second-class citizenship that many would argue exists up until the present. Chronicle how we began this presentation on how one gets elevated to the White House by making claims that were echoed, that were entrenched in the early 1800s in order to displace Mexicans and making them become Americans. So, and then we look at how different parts of the country that were incorporating these populations. So now in Texas racial law, we see even laws being created to keep Mexicans apart from associating with blacks, right? Where you see this town and 8 other counties that pass similar laws. Because if you have brown and black solidarity, it becomes a threat to white hegemony, white domination in Texas. And we know when Texas breaks off in 1836, which was a product of Mexico inviting white Anglo settlers from the South, from anywhere, to come and populate Texas, and as long as they met 3 conditions, right? And one of them being abide by Mexican law, which had abolished slavery already, to form the Catholicism, and just pass and become Mexican citizens. So the intent was never to become Mexican citizens or never to be seen as equal. It was in order to claim the land, which they did, and create their own laws here, right? So forms of radical political organizing take shape in California. This is prior to the Mexican Revolution. So things are occurring in Mexico. We know under the Porfiriato, which Luis Garcia Bedoya covers a bit, things are occurring where a dictatorship is forming. For 34 years, you have a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, who is in collusion with U.S. capitalists and selling a lot of the interest from the railroads, building a lot of infrastructure in the late 19th century. And at that moment, if we look at the late 19th century, that is the moment where the U.S. and the Mexican political economy become one. So historians, Gilberto Gonzalez and Fernandez tell us that that is the moment where this capitalist enterprise and collusion between the U.S. and the Mexican economy become one, where the necessary flow of Mexican labor is entrenched, institutionalized in that moment. But here you have some who resisted, right? The Flores Magón brothers. And they created their own party. They created their voice. They created a radical perspective to thinking about how to oust a dictatorship, but also how to move against the capitalist structures that were oppressing the mass of the workers, not only in Mexico, but in the United States. So the Flores Magón brothers, for their actions, and here in Los Angeles, they would go out to, and I placed the video if you'd like to choose to view it. It is very interesting, where they resided in LA and lots of activist circles and mobilized, but ultimately they were arrested and sent to Leavenworth Federal Prison, where they died. And under the Espionage Act of 1917, which is a law that still exists, a law that's still on the books, would place any dissent, any criticism of U.S. policy, any criticism against the U.S. involvement in the global war at the time as seditious. And now you are punished for that as a crime. And that's what these brothers were taken for. But their thought remains with us today. The Flores Magón brothers were very influential in creating and thinking about how freedom ought to exist. Not freedom as it is tied to think about what Ramirez mentioned earlier about becoming just giving up and assimilating to the dominant culture, but about how one remains free and how one retains not their own identity as either Mexican or American, but as a human subject. And Las Gorras Blancas, these were organized groups trying to reclaim their land, other forms of resistance that did engage in armed struggle against those who had taken their land, right? So in Nuevo Mexico, land that was taken, the people did not just give up. They removed, they reclaimed, and they organized and they fought back, right? So resistance, Las Gorras Blancas, Los Caballeros del Labor, and the United People's Party were consequences of a long process of economic and social deterioration in the situation of the Spanish-speaking people of northern New Mexico. Now, this quote that I have here is not from Garcia Bedoya, but it is from the historian Zaragoza Vargas. But organized resistance on such a large scale against the ruthless and greedy Anglo and Spanish-speaking ruling classes. Note, the Anglo and Spanish-speaking ruling class. So on a class dimension, you had some what were termed as, we think of vendidos, traders, or those who were working with the incoming Anglo elite, right? On a class dimension, they saw themselves closer to than their racial dimension, the way they had been racialized. Ruling classes in the territory that had not been seen since the Taos Revolt of 1847. As I mentioned, Porfirio Diaz, for 34 years, ruled as a dictator. He was ultimately overthrown with in the 1910, what set off the Mexican Revolution in 1910, which establishes now in Mexico a new constitution in 1917, which for the first time now provides the land grants for the population, or the ejido system. And now that ejido system would be taken away in 1993, in recent times, in order to produce the North American Free Trade Agreement. A specific article to the Mexican Constitution of 1917, Article 27, is what created the land grant. But in order to bring the signatories together of Canada, of the United States, and of Mexico in 1923, in that historic moment to create a free trade zone, what the elite class termed a free trade zone, was necessary. And the Mexican Congress acquiesced, as the Mexican Congress is a part of that upper ruling elite, similarly to the way the United States Senate and the House of Representatives are the defenders of the ruling classes also, right? Or part of the ruling class, especially at the Senate, the upper house. So as we're moving through this, these are just some of the facts on how the infrastructure that was being built in Mexico, namely the railroads and the empire, were being built. So Mexicans were building the American empire in Mexico, right? Does that make sense? How does that sound, right? When we're thinking about the Mexican empire being made in Mexico, because it was U.S. capital in Mexico, laying the groundwork, laying the infrastructure, in this case, the railroads, and bringing them, and even after bringing them into it in the United States. Now, how does U.S. capital dominate labor? And this is the U.S. Commissioner General of Immigration in the early 20th century, talking about Mexican labor met an economic condition demanding laborers who could stand the heat and other discomforts of that particular section. So thinking of who now not only who can work in those zones, but who is adaptable to a very harsh environment to do labor. And how much has that changed in the present day, right? When we're thinking about who are the essential workers, who are the people feeding us, who are the people serving. And if you see this here, this quote you can read for yourself and reflect on this, to think about the thought. This is official. This is an official quote here from the U.S. Commissioner, to think about who is willing to work for a low wage and who does the work for a low wage. So high-skilled labor, low-skilled labor, those classifications are all political classifications. And we will talk about, moving forward, on how the threat of deportability really conditions how migrants are,